Helen had quite a lot of money because she was the heir to the Tattersall's empire. Unfortunately, Helen was killed in that accident. Martin was hospitalised, but then he basically inherited a lot of Helen Harvey's estate. As to how much has not been totally transparent. As the sole heir of the Tattersall's empire, technically Helen may have been privy to $29 million. If that money was more in the region of $29 million, it would possibly suggest a very strong motive to be able to get rid of somebody like Martin Bryant and confiscate what would have been a very, very large inheritance. Welcome to the WASP Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. In one of the previous episodes we talked about whether someone as heinous as Martin Bryant allegedly is could have love in his heart. One of the other people that he cared very deeply about was Helen Harvey, of which there have been a lot of discussions and talk about. Helen Harvey was an unusual woman. She was the heir to the Tattersall's fortune and lived in a ramshackle little house in Tasmania that was overcrowded with pet dogs and a multitude of cats. She was an eccentric woman and lonely and lived by herself. And Martin came across her one day because he was at the time running a business cutting people's lawns and doing gardening, and he saw her overgrown garden and decided to knock on the door and see if he could offer his services to be a gardener and help around the house. He met Helen Harvey and they really hit it off. He was enamored of the fact that she had so many pets. It was a ridiculous amount of animals. At one point, apparently, there was a garage and it was filled with wooden crates that were just overflowing with cats, some of them feral and some of them pets, and she had dogs and parrots and birds. And because they had a shared love of animals, they kind of hit it off, and she was a much older woman, and there was no indication there was anything intimate or sexual between them. But they became very, very good friends. Helen had quite a lot of money because she was the heir to the Tattersall's empire. So she was very generous with Martin. She would take him out. They would, buy cars together. She would generally swap a car every week. And Martin would come along and they would go out to lunch and they spent a lot of time together. And Helen was living at the time also with her mother, who was not very well and who was pretty much forced to just be housebound. And it all came to a bit of a crunch when the authorities determined that, the house was unfit for habitation due to the animals and excrement all throughout the house and the lack of medical attention that Helen's mother was getting. And so the council showed up one day and they basically carted off all the animals, and basically Hilza, which was Helen's mother, she had to go to hospital. She had infected sores on her legs and so on. Helen had her own issues as well, but she loved Martin, and they would drive together. She did complain. One of the things that really worried her was that they would drive along, and every now and then Martin would wrench down on the steering wheel and almost cause a crash with the car driving into another oncoming vehicle. That did actually eventually occur. And I spoke to one of the ambulance officers who attended that scene, and all they came across was that there was a head-on collision. It hasn't been proven that he'd wrenched the wheel down that day, but given his propensity to do that, it's likely that was the cause of the accident. And unfortunately, Helen was killed in that accident, and Martin was fairly badly injured with his neck. And they had some animals that were in the car with them, some dogs, and one of those had been killed. Martin was hospitalised, but then he basically inherited a lot of Helen Harvey's estate. As to how much has not been totally transparent. Martin was given a sizable amount of money, Helen's house and a farm. So he basically inherited quite a lot of property and a lot of money. I believe the figure was around about 500,000, though there has been some question that as the sole heir of the Tattersall's empire, technically Helen may have been privy to $29 million of inheritance, which back in 1996 was an astronomical amount of money, even by today's standards. So as to whether or not that technically and legally would have then become the property of Martin, as she left everything to him, is another question. And also what then happened to all the proceeds of that inheritance is yet again another question. The notion was that these proceeds were sold and that a compensation were paid to a lot of the victims and their families from Port Arthur. One of my good friends, Stephen Howard, spoke of his displeasure at the way in which that was decided and undertaken. In his opinion, it was quite a pitiful amount that was offered. If, and it is an if, because the money trail has to be traced, if that money was more in the region of $29 million, where is it, who's got it, it would also possibly suggest a very strong motive to be able to get rid of somebody like Martin Bryant and confiscate what would have been a very, very large inheritance. So the money that Helen had left and the properties to Martin would certainly have enabled his kind of lavish lifestyle. He was travelling a lot, buying clothes, expensive clothes. He walked around Tasmania dressed rather outlandishly and expensively. He was quite bold about his wealth. But he was also placed on a guardianship order, so the trustees basically had to then control the amount of expenditure money would have. But Helen was a very pivotal part of Martin's life. There are some questions there about their relationship and how she factored into the crime that occurred later after his relationship with her. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the WASP Files. Feel free to share far and wide and see the attached files in support of the episode. Thank you.